Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the June 2019 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. Tonight we've got Todd Clint, who's talking about Office 365 and its buddy PowerShell. Take it away, Todd.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate you guys inviting me. Mike, I spoke for you guys like 6 or 8 years ago. It's been a while. I was telling my wife, I'm like, I think I did it one time a really long time ago. So yeah, these are two of my favorite things, PowerShell and Office 365. And so when Mike reached out to me and asked if I would do this, I'm like, if you'll make a bunch of people sit around and listen to me talk about PowerShell and Office 365, heck yeah, I'm in. One thing it is tough though, I'm sitting home. I don't know if you guys are watching the video or not, but I normally do this talk at conferences and I'm up and I'm moving around, but I have to sit still so that I'm sitting in front of my camera so you guys don't just see my belly walking by. So if I seem a little fidgety, it's because I'm used to being in the groove here. So let me go on to my next slide. So I'll cover that next slide. So this is me. I am Todd Clint. I'm a SharePoint MVP, and I've been a SharePoint MVP for a long time. And that's actually how I got into PowerShell, because when SharePoint 2010 came out, we were out at Microsoft, I think it was an MVP summit or something. And they're like, we have got great news. When you guys get the SharePoint 2010 beta bits here in a few months, we've replaced STS-ADM, the command line tool that you all know and love. We've replaced it with PowerShell. And I didn't know very much about PowerShell at the time, but I knew that I wasn't smart enough for PowerShell. And so I was going through all the different stages of grief. What am I going to do for my next job? Because I'm not smart enough for PowerShell, and I can't do SharePoint with PowerShell. There was the bargaining and the anger. And I finally moved to acceptance and have been loving PowerShell ever since. So I'm coming up on 10 years probably now, doing PowerShell all the time. And I just love it. But my area of focus mostly for the first, 7 or 8 years was SharePoint Server. And then as, like the inevitable march to the cloud, since I've been doing Office 365 most of the time, that's where my emphasis has been the last couple of years. So that's what we'll talk about today. All of the slides that I am going to talk about are already out on my website. So you can go to toddclint.com/MSPSUG, and there's a PDF file that has all of these slides. So go ahead and grab them. All the code's going to be out there, every link, it's already there, so go grab that now if you'd like to. My email address is also on this slide. It is the longest email address I have ever possessed. I've got a few years left in me, so I may end up with a longer email address at some point, but I just don't see how. But I am a consultant at a company called Simpraxis Consulting, and my email address is todd.clint@simpraxisconsulting.com. So I've already invited Larry to email me about some Power Apps and Flow things, but if you've got questions about this or anything else, you can send me an email. I'm out on Twitter also. I am @ToddClint on Twitter. I'm fairly active on Twitter. If you send me tweets, I'll tweet back. And then because this is a SharePoint engagement, I have to mention that I also do some part-time evangelist work for some folks at Syskit. They write tools that do SharePoint security scanning and inventory and all that. Really great stuff. You can go to syskit.com, trials of everything. Tell them I sent you. All of that. I like to put in agenda slides, mostly because it makes my slide deck look longer. If I slip these agenda slides in, it makes me feel like I've done more work. But really, we're going to talk about in 3 chunks tonight. And do we have a hard stop at 9:30, Mike, or if I run a couple minutes over, is it going to be okay?
You'll be fine. We normally shoot for about an hour for the presenter, but as long as we're done sometime before 10, we're good.
All right. I will do my darndest to be done. And again, Mike's known me forever. He can back me up. I'm a pretty friendly guy. So if I speed through something and you've got questions later, if you email me or tweet me, I'm happy to talk to you about it. So don't worry about that if we don't get hit something as hard as you'd like. But we're mainly going to spend our time talking about Microsoft's official PowerShell modules. As cruddy as they are indispensable. There's just some things that you have to do with that. We're going to talk about the patterns and practices PowerShell, which is just my favoriteest thing ever. And then we're going to look through some really crappy scripts that I wrote. As PowerShell people, you will be my PowerShell is abhorrent. I'm in a Slack channel with Jeff Hicks, and I feel like I owe his liver a big apology. I feel like I am probably the reason he drinks as much as he does because of how terrible my PowerShell is. So when I show you my PowerShell at the end, try not to judge it for the PowerShell, try to find the kernel of fun Office 365 in it, because to you guys, I just look like an idiot. All right, so first we will cover the official Microsoft modules. These are the modules that come out of Redmond. They are, written by Blue Badges, and they're just kind of the basis of what we're gonna, how we're gonna get in here. Before you can connect with like the Microsoft Online module and a bunch of the modules that we're going to talk about later, you have to install a couple of things. You have to have a few things in place. For PowerShell folks, this is all pretty simple, but you have to call it out. For the most part, you have to be able to run PowerShell as an administrator. Not always, there are exceptions to that, but you will stumble across times where you'll be halfway into something and then have to open up another host because you need administrator. So be able to do that. For most of the Office 365 things, they've really relaxed this. You used to have to be a global administrator or a tenant admin to run everything. Now that's not the case. They've broken the roles out now. There's Exchange admin, there's SharePoint admin, there's user admin, so I kind of need to adjust this slide. But you do need to have elevated privileges to run all of the PowerShell. You need to be running PowerShell 3.0 or later. I'm guessing everybody on this call is listening is higher than 3.0. 5.0 or 5.1 on Windows is best, and there's a thing there. If you don't have 5.1, you can do the PS read line and get all that. One thing that this question only comes up with PowerShell folks, will any of this work on PowerShell Core? And as far as I know, it does not. As far as I know, all of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight require Windows PowerShell. Now, I will say that I have not tested it extensively because I'm always in Windows, so it hasn't really come up that I need to run it, off my Raspberry Pi or whatever. But as far as I know, everything requires Windows PowerShell. And then finally, for some authentication pieces, there's this install assistant you have to install, sign-in assistant you have to install to be able to connect up. So this is the group of slides that Larry has been patiently waiting for the whole night. He's already typing how excited he is about all this. For PowerShell, there were really two pieces of it that I fell in love with, and there's a lot of pieces, a lot of things to love about PowerShell. But the ability, the pipeline and the ability to pass objects between commandlets in the pipeline and the looping and all that, it was great to be able to handle large chunks of objects inside of SharePoint, lists and libraries and sites and all those kind of things. That was great. The other thing that was great about PowerShell was the ability to automate things and just make things run. And when I was doing mostly SharePoint Server PowerShell, that was easy because there was an account on Windows that PowerShell ran as, and it ran on the box that SharePoint was on, and it hit the object model as that user, and I didn't have to worry about permissions. Now that I'm doing everything in Office 365, everything's in the cloud. Everything's a long-distance phone call. Everything has to be authenticated. And so I started having to battle passwords a lot. So anytime I talk about security, I like to remind folks that secure is not a Boolean. It's not whether something is secure, yes or no, but security is a continuum. And really on one end you have really secure, and on the other end you have really convenient. And when you're working with security, your goal is for any given situation, whether it's secure in your car or secure in your house or secure in your PowerShell scripts, is to find the spot on that continuum between convenient and secure that is correct for the situation. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So the first one is, we've all seen this. You can write your PowerShell scripts that connect to Office 365, and you can just do the whole get credential thing, type your password in every time. Super duper secure. Will never be a problem. It is also impossible to use. Everybody hates it. And you can't automate anything. You can't have things running in the middle of the night because somebody's got to be there to type a password. But it is very secure. So then there is a super easy way to do it, and just using plain text passwords and convert to secure string and all that. But that is incredibly insecure because then your passwords are just hanging out in plain text in your scripts for anybody to stumble across and get your passwords. That's a really bad idea. Don't do that. I used to then, so after I worked through those, and I'm like, well, I can do this encrypted file thing, so you can save an encrypted file and then pull the contents of that file out, and that can be your password. I did that for a long time. That was the best, the least bad of the options that I had, but that was also restricted by it could only be used by the person that encrypted the file and on the machine they encrypted it with. So then it became tough to automate things on servers because then I had to log in and the script had to run as me, or I had to log in as a script. It was just very complicated, but secure, but a little tougher to use. So then here, I can't remember when it was, 2 or 3 years ago, I was exposed to the idea of using the Windows Credential Manager. And the thing that I like best about this is that it's built into every version of Windows since Windows 8.1, I think. So any modern version of Windows is going to have it. So Windows 10 is everywhere. Every version of Windows has it. Windows Server 2016, 2019, they all have it. So I don't have to worry about maintaining it. It's going to be there wherever I need it. And the thing that I really like about it is I'm letting Microsoft worry about securely storing the passwords. I don't have to worry about whether, the encryption that I use, if I forgot to salt something or if I use AES, whatever, and that gets hacked and I got to go rewrite all my scripts. I don't have to worry about any of that. It's all Microsoft's problem. Because now in PowerShell, I can access the Windows Credential Manager and pull credentials securely out of that without anything being exposed. So this is the hard way, and on the next slide, I'm going to talk about the easier way. So if you go into the Start menu and type CRED, then you'll get the screen here. You want to go to Windows Credentials, add a generic credential. And that's those generic credentials at the bottom. This is where Windows stores all the credentials it uses for file shares and websites and all that. You're just adding another one of those. For the internet or network address, well, we're not really going to put that. We're not going to put an internet address. You're going to put the name that you want to access it as. So I'm going to call this one tenant admin. For username, I'm going to put the UPN, the user principal name of the tenant admin account. And then for the password, you guessed it, I'm going to type in the password. And then it shows up in the Windows Credential Manager there. So now I can use it from anything that can use credentials. So then if I want to access it, there is a module that I'm going to talk about later called the Credential Manager module. Has a commandlet, get stored credential. I can just call that, and the object that it gives back is the username and the password as a secure string. Or I can also use the PNP PowerShell, has an analogous command, get PNP stored credential. This is how I do 100% of my scripts these days. I never type usernames and passwords. Just today I was working on speccing out a customer thing. In reality, I probably would have had to type the password for the account that I was using twice maybe, but I spent like 7 minutes creating the stored credential because this is just how I do it. Josh in the chat is mentioning that he didn't realize that PNP had it. PNP not only has it, Josh, PNP does it one step further. Anywhere in the patterns and practices of PowerShell where it asks you for a credential, if you put a string that matches the name of a credential, it will automatically try to resolve that as a stored credential. So you can pass it a credential object and it will work with that, or it will resolve the string. It is the greatest thing ever. And I don't think I've got it in the slide deck, with either the June or the May update to the PNP PowerShell, they added an add PNP stored credential, so now I don't need that stored credential module at all. I can do it all inside of the PNP. Larry, you're asking if it works interactively. I think so. I don't know exactly what scenario you're talking about, but I can tell you I spend all day, every day, sitting in front of a PowerShell prompt just like this one, using these stored credentials. So when I'm running my commandlets, if I'm just whatever, this is all I do. I never type passwords anymore. It is the greatest thing ever. Mike, you said that there was another way to do it. What is the other way?
Yeah, and first I'll just add one more thing. So I use a module similar to this, but if you don't want to install the PNP module, Joel Bennett has one called Better Credentials.
Yes.
And that's what I use all day, every day, and it's very similar to what Todd's doing. The other way you could, there's actually two other ways that are very similar. So one is to use the protect CMS message and the unprotect CMS message, and you have to use a certificate with that. Now Dave Wyatt also has a module called protected data, and it's very similar to the protect CMS message and unprotect. He's got commandlets in there just like that, but it's for working with, you have to use a certificate.
Okay, so I've not done that. So yes, I use the Credential Manager module. There are better ones. I have not had a reason to use those yet, and I probably won't use any now that I have the PNP. Now that the PNP has add, I probably won't, because I do everything in PNP PowerShell these days. And for you guys who aren't looking in the chat, Larry asked if you could use this with the task scheduler. I assume that you can, as long as the user that the task is running as has the credential in its Credential Manager. I would certainly, if I was scheduling tasks, this is exactly the first thing that I would do for, I would try
Yeah,
first.
and you can use the task scheduler, and by that what I mean, you want to log in as your service account and store the credentials in his credential manager, and
Yeah.
then you run it the task as that user, and yes, then it has access to it.
Yeah, yeah. So that should work. So Mike mentioned the better credential module. I don't know what the usage is for that one, and I probably will update this slide for PNP. But this is how you can create them in PowerShell. So you can do it in the UI like I talked about. I don't do that anymore because the UI is for suckers. So I do it all in PowerShell, and this is the way that I do it. The couple of things about this that I have screwed up is if you don't, with this particular commandlet, and again, the PNP might be different and Mike's might be different. If you don't use this persist at the end, that stored credential will only be active in your current host, and then as soon as you close that PowerShell window, the credential will go away. And then you'll start doing that thing where you wonder if you're crazy, because then you open up another window, it won't be there, and you'll add it again, and it'll work, and be like, I'm having deja vu, and then you close that window, and it'll go away. Don't be that guy. I was that guy. So use the persist and local machine, and then it will go through. So that's that. This was a huge deal for me. I've had a couple of people talk about MFA. I've not had to do this a lot, but if you're using Microsoft MFA, you can use an app password for your PowerShell. Now, there's a whole bunch of security pieces that have to be in place at your tenant level. You have to have MFA enabled and all these other things. I don't want to get into that real far. But if you enable MFA and get all that created, you can create an app password for your account and then store it the same way that I showed you in the other ones, and that will work for PowerShell and will not require the two-factor bump that you'd have, the fob or whatever. If you're using something else, Okta, Ping, whatever, I have no idea how to help you with that one, but I'm guessing it's the same idea, some kind of an application password. And I've had to do that a couple of times for folks. So after you've got your passwords all figured out, we're going to start looking at the different modules. So kind of the base that I tell people about when they're connecting to Office 365 is just the tenant. We're talking users and groups and licenses and those kind of objects. You have call it 2.5 different modules that you can use for this. The first one is the oldie but the goodie, the MS Online one, MSOL. That one has been around for years and years and years. It's not being updated anymore, but it works for most everything. I mean, I can tell you things that it doesn't work for, but if you're doing licensing or just general users, it works pretty well. So to connect to that one, you connect to MSOL service, give it your credentials. It's smart enough to figure out what your tenant context is, and then you're off to the races. I usually do a get MSOL user after I connect just to make sure that it actually connected, because it doesn't give you any feedback unless something goes wrong. And you can use get command to find out what commandlets it has. That's the first way. That's the old way. The new way that Microsoft's telling you to do it is to use the Azure AD commandlet. Same idea, same scope of use. It's users and groups and licensing and those kind of objects. You can load that one. Mostly the same commandlets, a little difference here and there, but it's if you ever use the MSOL one, you'll find the Azure AD one is pretty comfortable to use as well. And you can have them both installed at the same time. So you can have them both installed, and as you're trying to figure things out in Azure AD, if you can't figure it out, you can drop back to MSOL. Works like a champ. I say 2.5 because there is also an Azure AD preview module that you can install that has the same commandlets as the Azure AD one. It's in the same namespace. That connects a different way, uses a little different authentication scheme. I've not had to use that one much, but if you see it out there, it is confusing that there are multiple versions of this ability. So I wanted to bring up a couple things. I love telling stories about stuff that I did that's dumb, because hopefully that will prevent you guys from doing stuff that's dumb. So this is one of the old school MSOL commands. This was a situation that I had several years ago. I was speaking at a conference, and if you guys have not used the demo tenants from Microsoft, if you're a Microsoft partner, go to demos.microsoft.com. They've got these big, elaborate Office 365 tenants full of users and email and sites. They're great for demos and playing around. They used to all have a common, well-known password. And I was talking to a buddy of mine who was presenting at a conference, and he had changed all of his user passwords because he had had an instance where as soon as his tenant name came up on stage during a presentation once, somebody in the audience logged into his tenant using the well-known password and deleted a bunch of stuff. I'm like, man, why would anybody do that? Like were these people not raised right? Were they not hugged enough? What? But having heard about it, I'm like, well, I should probably fix that. So I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to fix it, but I knew that PowerShell was really good at grabbing a big chunk of things and doing the same thing over and over. And I had a big chunk of things. I had usernames, and I wanted to change their passwords, so it seemed like the great thing to do. So I set out, get command user. I was looking at the set user. That didn't have it, so get command password. Hey, I've got it. So set MSO user password, exactly what you'd think. I was surprised that it took the password in plain text, which I've never seen before that or after that. But this does set it, unless you go out of your way, it does make the user reset the password the next time they log in. So it's not as bad of an idea, but pretty horrible. So then what I did was I took advantage of my vast PowerShell knowledge and threw this little ditty together, get MSOL user, pipe the output of that to set MSOL user password, take the new password, and I'm good to go. And it worked, and it did exactly what I told it to. And I didn't realize until a few days later that it did exactly what I told it to, and it changed all of my accounts and all my admin accounts and all my service accounts. So Azure AD Connect quit syncing, and all kinds of things broke. So this is a cautionary tale. This works, but make sure you understand the ramifications if you start making big changes like this, because they are pretty sweeping. I have not tried this yet with the Azure AD modules. They might be smarter. I think now when you do get MSO user, you have to, or Azure AD user, you have to have a special switch for the administrative accounts, and I think the sync accounts are protected from that too. But just, I've got many stories that I like to tell people that PowerShell is a lot like fire. It's a great tool, but you got to respect it because you'll get burnt, and PowerShell is very much like that. So that's some of the kind of tasks that you can run with the MSOL or the Azure AD modules. Skype for Business, unless anybody says otherwise, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Skype for Business because I don't think probably people do much with it. I will mention two things about Skype for Business in the module. Number one, it installs horribly. So don't, if you have to use the Skype for Business module for something and you've never used it before, you're going to need to budget probably 10 or 15 minutes to install the dumb thing. And the last two times that I've installed it, I actually had to reboot my box to be able to install it, which is just unconscionable these days. So just know that that's not going to go on very easily. And because of how Teams is kind of growing out of Skype for Business, but kind of not, the last time I checked, the Skype for Business module had 53 commandlets that had the word Teams in it, 51. So you may end up having to go into here to tweak some things, even if you're not using Skype for Business, but because of how Teams uses its backend. The last time I had to do it was I had to tweak the setting that allowed guests to share their screens or something in Teams. That was a setting that was in this module and not the Teams module. So you may end up having to do that, but again, it was I had to reboot it was terrible. So plan some time accordingly. The other thing about this is the prefixes are not always CS Online because of how the product's been renamed over the years, so you're better off. I don't know about you, but sometimes I do, get command noun MSOL star. Sometimes I do get command module MS Online. It's kind of, I find them to be interchangeable. For this one, you want to do module because they are just kind of all over the place. I am not a fan. Not some of Microsoft's best work. Exchange, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one either because I think you've probably done this one a lot. But this is for mailbox maintenance, creating mailboxes, things like that. This one is a little weird because it's a remote session that you download, so there's not a module that you install, but you do the remote session and you add it, you import the session, you do whatever. They tell you that it's limited to 3 sessions, but I've never seen that actually be enforced. I think that's one of those things they tell you so that if later on they need to do it, they can. But it's a little, for me, PowerShell with SharePoint was the first experience that I had with PowerShell, and so that just is how PowerShell is supposed to be. And every one of these modules is just a little different. The Exchange one to me is just a little odd in how that it works, but it works pretty well for the things that I've needed to do. I've got a couple of slides here. I'm not going to really hit hard, but creating mailboxes and all that. For me, going from on-prem servers like SharePoint and Windows to cloud servers, there was a couple of adjustments that had to be made. And one of them is this exact thing here. where if you create, and I guess it's maybe my next slide, not this one. Yeah, it's my next one. When you send commands, they're not going directly to the object model. They're not happening immediately. They're not immediately going into RAM. They're being queued up. They're being sent across the wire to another server where they're being queued and scheduled and all that. And so things like creating a mailbox and then getting a message that says, hey, this mailbox will be here in 15 minutes. You're like, what? I'm used to doing new SP site and getting a new SP site right away. So just kind of some adjustments there on how to, as you're writing your scripts, it's just a little different. This is just a basic script on how to create a mailbox. Not much to it. But I did get that whole, it's going to take 15 minutes to create it. One thing that you do have to do, and this is a lot easier now than it used to be, but you do have to license your users. So if you create a mailbox or you add a user in, with the Azure AD or the MSOL module, that user's not licensed. So you need to do that. And before you can license a user, you have to set their usage location. So that's why this is a two-step process. Now you can license by group, so you can add a license to an Azure AD group, and then as you drop a user in that group, they're automatically licensed. So if you go that route, you don't have to mess with this. This is one of the cases where I found that the MSOL commandlets are much easier to use than the Azure AD commandlets. The Azure AD commandlets have you doing this thing where you're creating a template of a license, and it's really ugly. I've never spent the time to really get good at that one. But this one, get MSOL SKU, it's just a string, and in this case, it was the name of my tenant and then Office 365 Business Premium. This is much easier. So something to keep in mind if you're doing that. And so that looks like this. Then I can do get MSOL SKU. It tells me what I've got, how many I've used. Pretty simple stuff. This is also good if you've got any kind of automated processes that are creating users. You want to run this at some point so you start getting low on users. It can kick something back to you. There's the user all licensed up. All right. So the SharePoint Online module. So I did, like 5 years ago, let's call it. I did a session at a conference in Australia on using PowerShell with SharePoint server, on-prem server, and it was wildly popular, met with much acclaim. They laughed, they cried, it was better than cats. And then when they were planning the conference for next year, they said, hey, that PowerShell session you did last year was just off the charts, but we've got a lot of customers now that are moving to SharePoint Online. If we bring you down to Australia, can you do that again, but for SharePoint Online? I'm like, for a trip to Australia? Absolutely. And this was just as I was starting to work with Office 365 and hadn't done much with SharePoint Online and PowerShell at all. And so when I started to write my session, I realized that the SharePoint Online modules weren't quite as mature. At the time that this happened, there were probably 600 or 700 commandlets for SharePoint Server. There were 37 for SharePoint Online. And I had a 75-minute session to talk about all 37 of them. So fortunately, we've made a lot of progress since then. The SharePoint module now is, it's not great, but it's not horrible. It's got 160 some commandlets these days. And it is, I like to think of it as, you need it for basic manipulation of SharePoint Online, so your rudimentary things. The other place that you will need this is anytime there's new functionality introduced into Office 365, the knobs and the buttons and all that and the levers to control that new functionality always show up in PowerShell first. And that is, it's great for us PowerShell folks, but it has a lot to do with Microsoft being a little lazy and a little expedient. So hub sites are a great example. You used to have to do everything with hub sites in SharePoint Online through PowerShell, because in order for them to put all of the settings and all that for hub sites in the UI, well, then they have to figure out what page it's going to be on and how it's going to look, and then how it's going to look in tablet mode, and then how it's going to look in phone mode, and there's just a whole lot of decision making to be done. And then once they get all that figured out, then they got to figure out what it sounds like in Spanish and French and all the languages that they translate Office 365 into. Or they can just throw a commandlet into PowerShell and be done with it. So this is one of the things that this module is good for, is anytime there's new functionality coming out, multi-geo, whatever, this module is probably going to be the first place where you're going to see the ability to tweak that. So it's a good one to have in your tool chest. But mostly past that, I don't use it for many things at all. It is now in the PowerShell gallery, though they wanted to give it the longest, kludgiest name that it could, so that's how you get the SharePoint Online module for PowerShell. Oh, I lost my focus here. When you connect to this one, I threw this slide in just because it's a little clumsy. You would think, since everybody's connecting to something at SharePoint.com, that you could just give it your tenant name, but you can't. You have to connect to SPO service. You're connecting to the tenant admin site, the cloud version of Central Admin, and you're connecting to https tenant-admin.sharepoint.com. It's not as easy to get to as the MSOL or the Azure one. It seems a little wordier than it needs to be, but that's what it is. And then again, if you connect successfully, it doesn't give you any feedback, so I always do something like get SPO site just to make sure that things are going up on there. And then, of course, get command will tell you what else is there. This slide is out of place, but here are the things that I've talked about so far. No, this is the right one. Okay, so these are all the pieces that I've talked about, just basically links for you. I have, and I'm going to cover it a little bit later, a blog post that has all the installs and all the versions and all that, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the links to the installs. This slide really comes out of the fact that back in the day, they weren't all in the PowerShell gallery, so you had to download them all, so I could probably pull this slide out. If you want to download them from the PowerShell gallery, this is the commands that you need. I'm going to talk later about Flow and Power Apps, and man, so we all have done enough with Microsoft that we know that Microsoft's a really big company, and it's fun to make jokes about the left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing, but man, it's just a big company. That happens. Where this is really happening a lot in Office 365 is I see product groups like Flow and Power Apps, the Power group, I forget what the hell they call it now, the Power Platform. They're writing PowerShell. Teams is doing it, but they don't know anything about PowerShell, so they're just not sticking to conventions. They're doing some really dumb things, and I need to work harder to get that straightened out. The thing about Power Apps and Flow that bother me is that there are two modules, not one for Flow and not one for Power Apps, but one for users and one for admins. And they use the same commandlets, so you have to install them in a very specific order, and you have to allow clobber, and it is just, it is ugly. But it is out there. And on this previous slide, if you go to the blog post on when they announced these, I don't have it on this one, I guess it must be on the next one. They tell you the order. This should not be necessary. They should have done this better. But this is a little ugly. And I talk a little bit about what those commandlets are in there a little later on. But it is tricky. So this is the, so you can update them all, use find module. Oh, man, so I must have, I'm missing a couple slides here. Where's that at? Anyway, I've got a blog post. So I've got it later on, okay. What I'll talk about later that talks about how to keep them updated and find out when they're behind. The thing about these modules now is they get updated fairly frequently. So you can get comfortable using the PowerShell for SharePoint module and then find out that you're, a couple versions behind. So I'll talk about that later. I probably should put that in here. But that's updating them. You can get them all through the module or the gallery. Okay. I'm not going to show you that. So we're not going to, I'll spend a minute. This was a really early script. I wrote this thing 5 years ago. Maybe it's horrible, but this was an onboarding script that I wrote for a customer where they were doing SharePoint on-prem, but they needed to do some hybrid activities. So they needed to create users online, and it was pretty ugly. But I used the on-prem Active Directory module, the MSOL module. I had a group that I was going to add this user to. So then I added the user to the on-prem group so that the SharePoint on-prem audience would see it because that was group-based. Then I went down to the Azure Active Directory Connect server, ran start 80 sync sync cycle, so that the user and all of that would get synced up to Azure AD and Office 365. Then I connected there, grabbed my domain, put my user together, set their location, license them up so that they'd be able to do the hybrid search, I think they were using it for. I haven't actually used that script in many years. It's probably pretty crappy. Microsoft Teams now has a module. This is more about creating teams and creating channels, a little less about, again, the settings. That's mostly in the Skype for Business one, but you do have this one. And later, I've got a slide with some of the places that I've used this, but this is also out there. Flow and Power Apps. So I mentioned before the install is pretty rotten. It's for creators and admins. So I've got a slide later. One painful problem that this module does address is ease of ability to find out where flows and Power Apps are in your organization. There's not a great way to expose where flows are at because users can create flows and they're stored, there's just not a great way to do that. There's some web interfaces that are coming along, but we're all PowerShell folks. So if you do this, you can get a list of all the flows and who the owner is. So if you know somebody's leaving, it can be part of your offboarding process to see if they've got any flows that they own, add another owner. Same with Power Apps. The thing about flows is they will keep running after the owner leaves, even if the owner's not licensed anymore. So then it becomes, if you have to change the flow, you have to figure out where it's at. It's a big mess. But the PowerShell module does help a little bit, but it is ugly. Office 365 groups, I'm going to talk about those a little bit later, but I did want to call out specifically that there are no groups modules because groups isn't a product. Groups is a security construct that impacts other products. It impacts SharePoint and Teams and Exchange and all that. So where we're at now is there is no groups module, but every module that groups impacts has their own little piece of the groups management story. I use PowerShell, or I use the PNP PowerShell mostly, but I've got a couple of examples later where I've had to kind of cobble some things together. But if you're dealing with groups, really you need to figure out what angle, what you're trying to do with the group, and then figure out which module has the best story for that. So we talked a little bit about the module that was out there for SharePoint and how kind of disappointing it was and it didn't do much. What were our options? So I tell this just because I'm getting old and I like to talk about back in my day so that the kids know that I had to walk uphill to school both ways and all that. But this is the way we had to do it. When I did that talk 4 or 5 years ago, when there was only 37 commands, this is how I filled my time. Since Office 365 is just a web resource, it's just out on the internet, it's just REST calls and all that, we were able to write back in the day PowerShell that used CSOM, the client-side object model, use CSOM calls to do whatever it was we wanted to do that was not built into the module. And I'm not going to belabor this point a whole lot other than to show how terrible it was so that you'll appreciate the PNP PowerShell. So we had to go in and write all of this. This 22-line monstrosity here is what it took to connect to SharePoint Online. This was all of that, and you can see there's passwords in plain text and just horrible things. If there's a list of bad practices in PowerShell, this would have half of them. But this is what it took just to get connected, just to run anything else. And then once I was connected, then I could run this other thing over there. That 18 lines over there, that gets me the subwebs of one of my site collections in Office 360 or in SharePoint. It was pretty bad. So that is the old stuff. That's what was bad. And there's more examples of how bad it was. In the chat, Larry is asking if I had to use the graph to connect to Azure AD. I have, and I will talk about that in a little bit, Larry. But yes, I have got to do battle with the graph. So that was the way we did it back in the old days when PowerShell was all on stone tablets and dinosaurs roamed the earth. And then this other thing came out. And I saw in the chat room, I think it was Josh mentioned that he had some familiarity with the PNP. I could do a 60-minute session on the PNP PowerShell. If you take nothing away from this session at all, you should take two things away. How to handle passwords using the Credential Manager, and just remember PNP PowerShell. That's all you need to know. You can figure out anything from there. So the PNP, the patterns and practices, was something that the developer evangelist group inside of the SharePoint product team came up with years ago to give developers patterns and practices that they should use when developing against SharePoint. Just kind of guide them along, show them how to do things. This was how they did that. Part of that was patterns and practices around how to write PowerShell for SharePoint. And so they wrote a few PowerShell commandlets to show how the PowerShell commandlets could be written. And then, gosh, those PowerShell commandlets were kind of handy, so they wrote a few more. The next thing you know, 300, nearly 400 commandlets later, we've got this impressive module of PowerShell commandlets that are just essential for managing SharePoint Online and a lot of Office 365. So while this is hidden in GitHub, you can now just get to it in the PowerShell gallery, except my image there is, I should have probably automated that. But you can, I'll have it later, but you can just use install module, SharePoint PNP Online, PowerShell Online. Now, the great thing about this is, Larry and I were talking before the show started, that SharePoint in the cloud really kind of grew out of SharePoint on-prem, which is how that story went. And as that change was happening, Microsoft introduced the client-side object model, this idea that they want to get as much of the active code not running on the server and as much running in the client side as they can. For SharePoint Online, that introduces two great benefits for Microsoft. Number one, it just takes fewer resources on their boxes. It's all on our browser. And number two, it's a great security step for them to keep code from running on their servers. So that's what this is. And since this is all based on this client-side object model, not only does it work with SharePoint Online, it also works with SharePoint on-prem. So I'm doing a job for a customer right now. He's running SharePoint Server 2019, and I'm using all PNP PowerShell for it. I had to use the on-prem PowerShell for one thing, and that was to create a new site collection, but everything else is just the PNP PowerShell, but with SharePoint on-prem. And there's a different version for that, and that works with 2016, 2013, 2019. They all have CSOM. There's a module for all of them, so it's really great. One thing that's weird about this, when you connect to with the PNP PowerShell, your connection is scoped at the site collection level. So I talked about how when you connect to Azure AD, you just give it a username and it figures out your tenant level. And when you connect to SharePoint Online, you give it that long URL to the tenant admin. That's at the tenant level. These commandlets are all scoped at the site collection level, which can be a little confusing when you start doing operations like copying files from one site collection to another or things like that. When you do those, and I'm not going to have any time to do demos, but when you do your connect PNP online command, there's a switch parameter, return connection, and you can assign that to an object, and you can have multiple connections open at a time to a site collection with PNP, and then you can pass those different connections in as you're doing objects. So it's completely doable. It's not totally intuitive, at least it wasn't for me, but that is possible. So this is just like a short list of my favorite PowerShell or my commandlets in the PNP. The PNP file, that noun, has a bunch of really great commandlets. Super easy way to upload files to SharePoint Online, add PNP file. Get PNP file, copy PNP file. I mean, these are all pretty self-explanatory, but just really makes file management a lot easier. We have set PNP file checked in and checked out. Now, when you're doing migrations or whatever, you can run this and it will just check all your files in or check all your files out. Super easy. PNP list, same idea. You can add or get or remove lists. I had an interesting conversation on Twitter today. I was writing some of my own functions for a customer, and it was a function that was creating objects, and it occurred to me I don't know when to use new and when to use add. So we have add PNP file, add PNP list, but new PNP unified group, but add PNP view. I'd never really sat down and thought about when you use new and when you use add. So I threw it out on Twitter, and one of my PowerShell buddies, Spence Harbar, about 7 seconds later had the answer. So that makes me think that it's just a super easy question that everybody in the PowerShell world but me knew the answer to. And the answer is that you use new when you're creating containers. So new PNP unified group is something that contains things. And you use add when you're creating a thing that goes in a container. So I'm adding a file, well, that file goes in a list, but that list goes into a site. And so that's why we have new PNP unified group, but add PNP file, add PNP folder. And again, I just had this conversation today, so I haven't had a chance to go back and look at all the modules that I've ever used and see if that's consistent, but that was just something I'd throw out there because I've been doing PowerShell for almost 10 years now, and I didn't know the answer to that one. So Josh is like, yeah, PS help. I saw that dumb question come across. Yep. I had to know. It's something that's been bugging me all the time. Another question I've never heard an answer to is why so many banks and churches start with the word first. First National Bank, First Baptist Church. I don't get it. I'll figure that one out someday. So we've got PNP list. We've got PNP list item. This is great for walking through lists in SharePoint. Set PNP list item is great for setting values for those list items. I've been doing a bunch of that lately. It's been really great. Get PNP property is a tricky one. And this one I've mostly gotten figured out, but it's taken some trial and error. So we've talked about how Office 365 is sitting up in the cloud doing its cloudy thing. And if I do get PNP list item and there are 10,000 list items, well, that's a pretty big payload. But that's not all. Every one of those list items has a dozen properties, a couple dozen properties. We're talking created by and created, modified by and modified. I mean, just everything. What does not happen is the collection that you get back is not every property of every object in that collection. The schema gets downloaded. You can do a get member and you can see the names of all the properties, but not all of them are populated. So then you get into the situation, you're like, all right, well, get PNP list item where, name equal blah. Name's a bad example, but name equal blah. And it will give you this error message that says it doesn't have that property value. And you're like, well, of course it does. I just did a get member. It's listed right there. And you try it again. It doesn't work. It's giving you that error because when the CSOM ran, when the commandlet ran, it didn't pull that particular property of that object down. So that's why you can't filter on it or manipulate it. So get PNP property is the way to fix that. So you pass get PNP property your object or your array of objects, and then which of the fields or the properties that it didn't bring down, and it will pull those specific properties down and populate them inside of your object. So then you can do your calculation. So one of them, and I was doing battle with it today, there is a commandlet get PNP folder, which gets you the folders inside of your document libraries. And since you can nest folders, the object returned when you do get PNP folder may also have folders of its own, and so there's a property folders, but that property is one that is not populated. So I have to do get PNP folder and then get PNP property, folder object, property, files and folders, and then it pulls that down, and then I can do my wheres and I can do all that. But that get PNP property, if you're ever in this situation where you're getting this crazy error message, that's probably what it is. Restore PNP recycle bin item. I've got a really hysterical story about that I will tell you here in a minute. Office 365 groups. This is one way that you can manage them here with the PNP. I bring that up just so they get into your purview. Larry is asking, has my organization moved to group-based licenses in Azure? I don't know if I have or not, Larry. Honestly, that has been enough of a non-event that I just haven't heard much about it one way or the other. Like, I think people are using it, but nobody complains about it. Nobody complains about licensing, so I think it's valid. If you're not doing it now, I think you should try it and let us know. Okay, since we just have a few minutes left, I want to hit some of my examples. I don't see this much anymore, but this came up. I had a couple of customers who didn't want to use the PNP PowerShell because it didn't come specifically from Microsoft. This slide is really just all the arguing points about that. It does come from Microsoft. It's signed with Microsoft's key. They started doing that a little over a year ago. The senior program manager for SharePoint engineering, Vesa Juvonen, is the main owner of the project. So it's completely valid. I use it every customer that I ever deal with. So this slide is basically just references for you. Okay, so this is all of the commandlets that I've talked about and how to install them. And this, I've got this slide and the other slide. They're all out of place. I need to reorder this deck. But this is all of the installs to get them all And this is the blog post that I wrote that has them. So you can go to toddclint.com/posh Office 365 modules. It has all of this information, and it also includes what the current version is. So if you want to know, when the last one was, you can go to this blog post and look at it. And then I wrote another, man, I'm terrible at this. I wrote another blog post that has a little PowerShell snippet that will walk through all of the installed modules that you have and tell you if there's a newer version. And then you can do the update on that. So if you go out, I don't know if I have it linked in here or not, but it's one of my recent blog posts. So then I run that thing just a couple times a week. And if a new version of the PNP PowerShell pops up, it tells me and I update it. However. Okay, so I got a couple minutes left for examples. I talked about how easy it is to upload a file into Office 365. So this is how you just add a file. The tricky part here is that while shared documents is a document library, this folder parameter here includes the document library name. Kind of tricky. So I just kind of bring that up because I stumbled over that when I first started doing this. So you do need to put the document library name in as the folder parameter when you're adding a PNP file. And then you ask yourself, well, what do you do if you have a folder in there? Well, you just throw that onto the beginning. So I created a folder in my folder called folder. I'm terrible at variable names. And then when I upload the file, now the variable, the object folder is shared documents, and then the folder one at the end. That's terrible. But that just kind of tells you the folder is the shared document library and the folders and subfolders inside of that. And then you've got get PNP folder, and just a reminder that you have to do get PNP property to get all of the fun stuff on that. This is one of the ways to get how files are shared inside of Office 365. It doesn't get all of them, and honestly, this all keeps changing. I don't even think this slide works anymore. But it was just a way for me to show there was a field value shared with users. Get list item, that's probably not a great deal. Oh, so this was a good one. The thing I liked about this was when I do get PNP list, it includes everything. It includes all the lists and libraries, but it doesn't include all the fields. So I told it to make sure and include is system list in default view so I could filter on them. Because if I'm looking for shared files, I don't care if it's a system list, and I don't care. So I could say if system list is not equal true, and then I don't care about lists. I only cared about document library, so I could say if the base type is document library. Then I just walk through it. I was kind of with it, but I don't think that property exists anymore. This was one that I wrote for a customer where they wanted some of the compliance and content type information for an object for all the documents they had. And so I used the same magic that I used before. I filtered out the system list. I looked at only the document libraries. But here's how that get PNP property works. So I got all the documents in the document, in the document library. Let me turn my pen on here. I got all the documents here, and then I knew that compliance info was not, and content type was not part of the values that came down, even though it was in the schema. So I said, take that, pipe it through for each, and then run that get PNP property. The client object is the current object in the pipeline. The property that I need is file and compliance type and content type. And then it went ahead and hydrated all those properties inside of that array, and then I just walked through that array and spit out a custom object that had that information. So that's where I first did battle with the get PNP property. This is a fun story. I know we're over time, so I'll tell it quickly, but basically I had a user that one of the people at their company deleted a bunch of files out of SharePoint, about 100,000, 93,000, something like that. And then didn't tell anybody right away, told them a couple weeks later. So I had to write a PowerShell script that would restore all of those files, but only files that were deleted by a specific user, only a specific type of files, only in a specific subfolder, because they had everything in one document library. So there was just a lot of great PowerShell tools in here that I got to use. The shading just is the every other line thing, so it's easier to read. So what I ended up with here is I found that there was 93,000 of them, so then I broke them up into chunks of 10,000 and ran it on different machines and different hosts. What I found is that the PowerShell window was the bottleneck, so if I ran 3 or 4 hosts on one box, they all restored at the same speed, and then I could start throwing some on another box, because about 4 is where I started getting it to be a problem. So I basically just walked through, did the restore, recycle bin, But this was, I just had a lot of where objects in here, where the directory name is where the folder was and where it was deleted by. And I understand now that with where and for, I can do those a little bit more efficiently, so I would probably write this differently if I had to write it today. But there's a blog post on this right there. When you create new sites or new teams or whatever in Office 365, the default behavior now is to create an Office 365 group, but that doesn't happen consistently with all of the commandlets. So I threw this slide and the next slide in just to talk about how that works. If you use the SharePoint Online module, you only get a SharePoint site. You don't get a group, though you can create a group based on that site later. They call that groupifying the site. You can't connect it to an existing group, but you can create a new group based on that. If you use the PNP, as of the last time I checked, which was a couple of months ago, it creates a group, but it does not create a team for that, but you can create a team for that. So if you do it this way, and then you can go to teams, you can say new teams. It will show you the groups that you are an owner of that do not have teams, and you can add a team to that. Here's one place where I use the Teams module. Now, one thing I don't like about the Teams module is it doesn't have a prefix, so it's just new team. It should be like new Teams team or something. But if you create a new team, it will create an Office 365 group, and then that will create the SharePoint site and the Exchange distribution list and all of that. Larry was talking earlier about provisioning, and I talked about how I hadn't had to do anything with C#, though his thing was about passwords. We covered that earlier. But there are a couple of different provisioning engines inside of the PNP PowerShell or inside of Office 365. So this is one way to provision sites based on a template. So you can use get PNP provisioning template out to get the schema of the site, and then you can add specific things, files and folders and all of that. And then you can apply that template to an existing site and stamp out the schema. Very handy for stamping out consistent sites. Larry also asked about the graph. This is the most that I've done with the graph. I had to copy Office 365 permissions. You can't nest Office 365 permissions anywhere. You can't put an Office 365 group inside of another Office 365 group. You can't put an Azure AD group inside of an Office 365 group. None of that. So I had to write this commandlet that would copy group permissions because a customer had two groups that they needed to have exactly the same permissions. What I didn't put in this slide that I should have is for this to work, when I used Connect PNP Online, I had to use a -graph parameter, and then I had to do the app module thing. But this is all done through the graph. So basically I walked through, grabbed the two different groups, made sure the PNP module was loaded. Also had to have a parameter in there if I wanted to merge the groups, because after I wrote it, they're like, well, what happens if we add one to the other and then it gets overwritten? So I had to write the merge, which was kind of a pain. But I did that. So this one has a couple of sticky spots in it. The group part was part of it. The merge part was part of it. The other thing is, if you look at it, the owners and the members are stored separately. So there's a Get PNP Unified Group owners, and then there's a Get PNP Unified Group members, which do the obvious thing. They get the owners and the members of the group. So you would think that if there is a Get PNP Unified Group owners, then there would be a Set PNP Unified Group owners. That's how most PowerShell works. In reality, that's not how they coded this one. Instead, they have a Set PNP Unified Group that has a -members parameter and a -owners parameter. So I had to add the array of each in there as I built that up. So this was very handy. Got this all working, and they were very happy. And again, I wrote a blog post on that, so you can go there. Quick slide to get flows. You have to add a Power Apps. So the way you connect with this is by add Power Apps account. It is just it's like this was. It's like this module was written by a bunch of drunk 7th graders. It's not good, but it does work if you're able to piece it together. When you run the whole get admin flow, it returns back the GUID of the user that owns it. So that's just ridiculous. So then you have to use get MSOL and resolve that. It's just bad stuff, but this works. It does. This gets, so the get admin flow is like, at the tenant level you run to get all the flows. There's a get flow that gets all of your personal flows also. So that's get flow gets all your personal flows, but you can see here, the flow name and the owner and all that's all in GUIDs. It's just ridiculous. Speaking of flow, you can disable the flow button. Not particularly handy. I've got a blog post on that as well. Power apps, get power apps. Same drunk 7th graders. That is it. So let me jump back to that slide. So that is my contact information. If you've got questions about this, you can email me or hit me up on Twitter. That URL you should be able to download the slide deck and have all the links and all the code and all that. Thank you so much. I know it's getting close to a lot of your bedtimes. Larry's in New York. It's the news is almost on. It's getting dark up there. But for those of you that want to stick around for a couple minutes, if you've got questions, I am happy to answer them.
If anybody's got any questions, feel free to unmute and ask them, or just type them in.
Either way. You're welcome, Josh. Hope you picked up a couple of handy notes.